everyone, this is Ahav Ever from the Chronicles of Ahav Ever, and today's video is going to be dealing with the issue of what is the Torath Mosheh Jewish textual hierarchy. So today I'm going to be doing this video concerning what I would call the levels of text. This comes up because of the fact that sometimes people seem to confuse the issue where they think when someone talks about the Tanakh, the Hebrew text of the Tanakh, as if it's like one text that's all equal in all parts. And essentially what I'm going to be doing in this video is showing in terms of Torath Mosheh, what is the like hierarchy that takes place. And the best way I can give an example is like a building. So essentially when a person is looking at a building, often people see like a finished product on the street and then they think, okay, that's just a building, is it what it is? But if you consider, okay, well, there's a lot of things that go into actually building a building. And you have to take into consideration that not all parts of the building are equal, and there's some parts of the building that, if done incorrectly, essentially don't allow the building to stand or even have like the proper methodologies, as well as doesn't follow the proper concepts and laws around it. So the best way to understand the concept of what text are considered to be and what's acceptable in the Torath Mosheh mindset, you have to consider the whole thing to be like a building. So taking this building concept, we want to start with the first category, which is the Torah scroll, which is the foundation. Essentially, this means that when one wants to start considering what holds up this whole building, if life, if the reality we live in is like a building, the Torah for the Jewish people is the foundation. As I've mentioned in a previous video, the 613 mitzvot of the Torah are the foundation of the Jewish nation, while the 7 mitzvot are considered to be the foundation of the non-Jewish nations. So you may ask a question, okay, why is the Torah considered to be like the foundation of building? And the reason is because when the Torah was given to Moses, to Moshe ben Amram, essentially what happened was the creator of all things, before Moshe ben Amram passed away, basically called him and gave him the text of the Torah as we have it today. Meaning that the creator of all things gave Moshe exactly what words to put in, from start to finish, exactly how to space them, how to spell them, how to state them. And that text, as I mentioned in previous videos, came without any kind of vowel signs, without any kind of punctuation. And it requires an oral transmission to even know how to read it. Essentially from the point from when Moshe Rabbeinu wrote a Torah scroll, he wrote the first one. After that point, he wrote 13 copies of that. So essentially what happened was the first Torah scroll he wrote went to the Leviim and also the Kohanim. So that essentially stayed with the Aron HaKodesh, which is the Ark, if you will. And it stayed with the Kohens, the priest, and it was placed in the temple during the time that the temple stood. And from that point, all the other 12 Torah scrolls that he made, each one went to a different leader of the different tribes, the 12 tribes of Israel. And from there, people made copies from those. So essentially, it's like saying you had 13 master copies that were spread amongst the Israeli people, the Jewish people at the time, with one being like the main one kept in the Mishkan, or the tabernacle, and then later in the temple. And then from there, people could essentially make copies of the ones given to each shevet, each tribe. And if there was ever a question with the text, you would essentially go to Jerusalem, go to the temple, and request, from the Kohanim to, verify whether or not that Torah scroll is correct compared to the one that the main one, the first one that Moshe Rabbeinu had written. So that's the foundation of all things. So it means that everything a Jew does, the foundation of it is the written Torah. This is, for someone who keeps Torath Mosheh. And the same is true for Orthodox Judaism. Orthodox Jews have the same basis because essentially, as I mentioned in a previous video, Orthodox Jews are simply a form of Torath Mosheh that came out of Europe, for example. So again, going by this principle that the Torah itself is the foundation of all of Torah-based Jewish concepts and ideas. So it means that when someone's talking about Torah-based Judaism, as an example in the modern speak, this is how you differentiate between, for example, if you had different movements you were looking at and saying, well, there's this movement over here that calls itself Judaism. What's the difference? Well, essentially, if you go back several thousand years and you don't see those movements there, then you have to say, okay, well, what was available? What did exist? And if all you see, for example, are Jews who keep the Torah, and they keep it in pretty much the same way, then you'd have to say, well, that's the foundation. So there's some people, of course, who take the Torah and make it not the foundation, but that's their own invention. That's not something that's ancient. So essentially, the building blocks for, determining, the lifestyle of the nation, of the Jewish nation, and also the non-Jewish nations, is the Torah, and that's the foundation. It's not the full building; it's just the foundation from which a person builds upon. So what this essentially means is that if you were to go around and do a tour of ancient Jewish communities, the most ancient ones, and even some of the ones that broke away from ancient Jewish communities, what you would find is that the Torah is, as I mentioned before, the foundation and the central point. And we'll get into exactly what that means in a little bit more detail. But when you go around to different Jewish communities, you expect and you do find that Torah scrolls are pretty much the same across the board, from every community. And that you would think that after about 2,000 years or more of exile, that you would have huge differences in Torah scrolls where you don't find that. You find that even Jewish communities that were far flung and had no or little or no connection to other Jewish communities still have the same Torah scroll that is found amongst other Jewish communities. The major differences would just simply be how someone writes the actual script it a little bit, more meaning that one person stylizes it one way that came out of their community, but it's always the same text. So that if a Jew from Italy went to read a Yemenite Torah scroll, they know what they're reading. If a Jew from Yemen went to Iraq and read an Iraqi Torah scroll, they know what they're reading. And so on and so on. Spanish Jews go to China, they all read the same text. So now we'll get into category 2, which is the Tanakh. And this would be considered to be almost like the upper levels of the building. So when trying to understand this category, you have to first understand that this is not a book in the form that most people think of it, meaning that yes, the Tanakh, the Hebrew Tanakh, is considered to be a book to some degree, but it's not considered to be a book from interconnected book. Meaning that what basically happened is that there was a concept of putting together all of the most ancient and authoritative and accepted Jewish writings of a certain point together into almost like a one-stop shop together, and that was a certain concept that came about later in Jewish history. But the basis is that the first part of this text, of the Tanakh, is like an acronym, meaning that it has the Torah, and which is of course the 5 books of Moses or Moshe Rabbeinu. And essentially that is the primary source in this text, meaning that if you take anything, 100%, it has to be from the Torah. The Torah is the foundation, as we mentioned before. And the next group of texts mentioned in it is the Nevi'im, which are writings of Israeli prophets, and it also includes elements of history in it, and also warnings to do the Torah. And essentially the next level is the Ketuvim, which are collected writings, also concluding histories, and also different wisdom of Israeli Torah scholars. So what's important to note is that the reason why you see the Torah part of it on the left bigger is because of the fact that the Torah is not on the same level as the Nevi'im, the Ketuvim. Meaning that a person could essentially have the Torah, never know about the Nevi'im, the Ketuvim, and be perfectly fine. It's not a requirement to have the Nevi'im and the Ketuvim. There's pertinent information in those other texts, but it's not like a requirement to have those texts where the Torah is the basic requirement. And one of the ways to understand that is just the following. That in Jewish understanding, essentially when there's a return of a Davidic Torah-based kingdom in the land of Israel, the only 2 things that will be used from this text called the Tanakh are essentially the situation where the Torah still is there, but then the Nevi'im are basically taken away. There's no need for them at that point. And the Ketuvim are also taken away, and essentially the Torah and the book of Esther are the only 2 books in this official sense that will exist. And the simple reasoning is this, is that once there's a return to a Davidic king, where the whole nation of Israel, in the land of Israel, is keeping the Torah, there's no longer a need for the prophetic writings of the prophets. The prophets are only there to warn the people that, hey, you're not doing this correctly, you need to return to the Torah, you need to not do this instead. That was the whole point of those writings. There wasn't any reason that those writings have to last forever, for example. And essentially the Ketuvim also have some intent and purpose similar to it, where once the Davidic kingdom is reestablished in the land of Israel, then that doesn't need to be there. And the book of Esther remains simply because of the fact that it has a similar element to it, to what the Torah has about the leaving of Egypt, for example, what's called in Hebrew Yetziat Mitzrayim. And it basically tells the story of how the Jewish people overcame the situation and returned back to being Torah-based after having a situation where they had not been Torah-based for a while, and then having this dangerous situation happen that was overcome by the will of Hashem. So essentially that's where Jewish practice is that essentially the other books of the Tanakh fall out at some point when this kingdom is established, and then you have the Torah, and then you have the book of Esther still there. Then the next category is what's called halachic text or halakha. So essentially this group can be made up of things, for example, like the Talmud, which is a collection of different discussions and debates, as well as different insights into what's called halakha. And then you also have books that simply take that information and kind of put it into a more organized format so that a person can know what the basic practices are. So to explain what halakha means, what it is that in the Torah there is a command, which I've covered in other videos, to establish what's called a Sanhedrin, or like a Bet Din Agadol in Hebrew, which the best way to probably put it in English would be a Mosaic court, meaning that there essentially is a Supreme Court that was, basic sanctioned in the Torah, and that had existed throughout most of Jewish history, like with the exception during the exiles, and even sometimes during the exiles, it still existed. But essentially, what this Torah-based court is that they're the ones who determine how to actually do the Torah in areas that haven't been covered before, and they're also the ones who pass on the information that had been passed on from Moses, from Moshe Rabbeinu, Moshe ben Amram. And essentially, it's like saying if there were ever a question anywhere in the Jewish nation of how to do the Torah, or any kind of mitzvah that came into question, or any conflicts, essentially it goes up to different courts, and then the highest court is the Sanhedrin that can make a ruling, and whatever ruling they make is what's considered halakha, meaning that's Jewish law. That's, the practice, we go by the majority. If one person dissents, but the majority, and this is only like if you will, the all-stars of the Torah, meaning that the only way to be on the Sanhedrin, a person would have to be an all-star in the Torah, meaning that they would have to know the Torah and know previous, halakha, previous Jewish law that had been passed down. They would have to be fluent in Hebrew, fluent in Aramaic, and fluent in other languages. They would have to have specialties. Like, so for example, one person may be, have a specialty in thermodynamics. Another person may be a math, expert in astrology. Another person may know cultures, and another person languages. Another person chemistry, all these different sciences, and you bring them together, and that would basically mean 71 of the highest level of sages in Israel. To basically be the deciding body, and that's outside of the king that was there. Once you have a Davidic king, he also can do certain mishpat, but they're also the ones who determine what the halakha is, and they pass on the halakha from generation to generation, from Sanhedrin to Sanhedrin. So as an example, whenever there was time to establish what the new month was, which Jewish months are based upon the moon and sightings of the moon, essentially you can't just have everybody out there doing it on their own. The Sanhedrin is the one who does it based on witnesses, and then from there they're the ones that says, okay, we've checked all the witnesses, we've checked all the data. This is when the new month starts, and spreads that information to all the people of Israel in the land of Israel. So going by this alone, this means that the basis of Torath Mosheh is legal, social, and national, meaning that you start with the Torah, the Sefer Torah, which is on the left, you go to the Tanakh, which is on the top, and then you have halakha. These three sources are considered to be the baseline of all Torath Mosheh communities, meaning that even if I disagree with someone about a principle that is not, legal in nature, not Torah-based or Tanakh-based in nature, and even if we do disagree on the sources, we still agree on what the basic principles are from the Torah, and we also agree on what's required for us to do. So this is one of the reasons that, as I mentioned in other videos, when you look at Jews who wear tzitziot, the Jews who follow Torath Mosheh wear them in situations that are required based on halakha. There's no debate about if you have a four-corner garment that you have to put tzitziot on. There's no debate about that. Torath Mosheh Jews, for example, put on tefillin, at least for the shachari, the morning prayers. That's a requirement. Everybody knows that. So there's basic things, we know when the Pesach happens, we know when things, how to do certain things. And there are areas where we can disagree in, and we can have variances in the things that are required. But the basic requirements have to be there, for someone to claim that they're following Torath Mosheh. And every ancient Jewish community does that, and as I covered in other videos. So the next aspect, the next category of if you're taking the building concept again, is what's called Agada Midrash and Musar. And even within these, you can find other things like commentaries and things like that. But basically, this information is made up of different information that's been passed down throughout different Jewish communities, throughout different people who are knowledgeable in the know, who've had traditions passed down to them. That helps us, basically do the first two, meaning that you have the Torah. But there's elements of the Torah, which again are the basis of the foundation. And once a person's built that foundation, basically a person studies and learns Torah and learns about the reality around us. And there are other people who've gone through that process before in the past, and they've written things down that we use today to understand and also to excel, to debate, to question, and things like that. So these texts can be found across the board in every Jewish community, where there's always been people within every Jewish community who've considered things and written things down. And there are those who we study, because of the fact that what they have written has been so universal or universally accepted to the point to where people, Jews around the world, will study it and learn from them, and also continue to build that basis after they have the foundation of the Torah with the writings of these different people, these different sages or chachamim amongst the Jewish people. So what that basically boils down to is that you have a situation where a person in their individual time learns Torah, learns halakha, learns all these things, and then also maybe apply some of what they have learned into teaching other Jews. So there's a requirement, for example, that every Jewish man is supposed to spend every day of his life, from the time he's like old enough to understand until the time that he dies, learning and teaching Torah. So it's like saying if a person has sons, he has to teach his sons Torah. If he has grandchildren, he teaches his grandchildren Torah. And if he has neither sons or grandchildren, he has to go out and learn Torah and teach Torah to someone. Doesn't matter who they are. And essentially, everyone he teaches Torah, in a sense, becomes almost like a son to him. So it'd be like someone saying, if a person, let's say you have someone who's a rabbi. This rabbi here in Jerusalem who passed away a few years ago, and supposedly he had like about 1,000 descendants, meaning that he had like 1,000 children and grandchildren that came from him. But then when you go try to go to his funeral, it was so packed with, in the area because of the fact that he had taught so many people Torah, and people who he taught had taught other people, that essentially you couldn't even get into the neighborhood where the funeral was, because there was just so many people packed there. And essentially it's like saying all those people were like his descendants in a sense. So again, taking this back to the building, as we said, the Hebrew text of the Torah, the hierarchy is that the Hebrew text of the Torah itself, the Sefer Torah, is the foundation. And from there, a person builds themselves upward with the halakha, which are the practical application of the Torah, and the agreed upon practical application of the Torah, as well as the different understandings and things that have been done in other generations and other Jewish communities, to which a person can build themselves up and also build up their community as Jews to do the will of the Creator of all. So in conclusion, what we're essentially looking at is that all Torath Mosheh texts point back to the Torah. So essentially, if a person had a question, the Torah is always the foundation and is always the starting point. And then from there, everything else builds up towards that point. So this is Ehav Ever from the Chronicles of Ehav Ever, and I hope that helped explain the hierarchy of Jewish text. Thank you. Bye.